Callinicus, whose brother, for instance, tried to usurp the kingship. That was the case of the first Anabasis of Antiochus Megas, who had Achaeus in his back. So all the kings who are not underlined were in that particular hard situation at home. The one marked with the plus, that meant a cross. It meant that they died while trying to conquer the east, and that small sign for the other two kings meant that they became prisoners. And that is the interesting question to ask about the Seleucid Anabasis. Why they did it, and especially why they did it the way they did it. Obviously, I imagine that they did that precisely to return home loaded with the burden of their own charisma of Alexander the Great emulators, and of course with the riches of the East. And in just one case, this action succeeded. It was in the case of the first Anabasis of Antiochus III. It was a military way of imitating Alexander the Great, which is specific to the Seleucid dynasty, and also to the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. For instance, Demetrius was one of the kings who emulated Alexander by conquering India. How was the king on the battlefield? Well, on the left there is the famous medallion, the so-called elephant medallion. The cavalryman charging dashingly towards the elephant is supposed to be Alexander. It is a whole discussion on the matter. Frank Holt has resolved that it has to be Alexander. In some, according to the sources, some other believe that it may be Taxiles, one of his allies, but obviously it is a Macedonian cavalryman, so it cannot be Taxiles. The figure on the right on the elephant is Porus. Well, and this coin, for instance, shows exactly the heroic gesture of the conqueror, who paid with his body in the fight. As you can see, Alexander was wounded. That was in some other cases. That was, for instance, in the case of the battle at Issus. That's a different battle. With the battle on the medallion, the trouble is that all the sources do not show us Alexander charging Porus directly. So that is the only problem with this hypothesis. So that is the heroic stance that Alexander was to be depicted. And on the others, obviously it is him. He's crowned by, with a victory by a victory goddess. And this is how the Seleucid kings were supposed to be. And this is how they behaved, especially in battle. The first passage deals with Antiochus Megas, and it is precisely a passage concerned with his first Anabasis. He is now charging against the Greco-Bactrian cavalry. The Greco-Bactrian cavalry, which was quite fearsome, actually echoes of that cavalry are to be found in the Indians' grammars, for instance, the cavalry of the Adanas. And as you can see in the underlined passage, in this action the king had a horse killed under him. Alexander had it too. Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander, had horses killed under him, and lost some of his teeth by a blow on the mouth. And his whole bearing obtained him a reputation for bravery of the highest description. The other passage, unfortunately, is from the period that I'm dealing with, and it is a period where the sources are very scarce. And it deals with the king, with one of the last Seleucid kings, who now turns south, perhaps in the last known Anabasis of the Seleucids, against the Nabatean king Aretas, the Arabian Harid. And as you can see, but unfortunately the description of Josephus is not pretty much detailed, he was killed in battle in a very heroic but useful but not pointless stance. And how did that work? Why was it necessary? This is a passage which does not deal directly with the Seleucids. It deals with the wars of the Diadochi, the successors. Craterus was one of the best friends of Alexander, perhaps the second best after Hephaestion, and he was one of his, let's say, peers, and he was one of his peers, and he was very much loved by the Macedonian army, as you can see in the passage down there. For the Macedonians longed for him exceedingly, and if they should only see his cap and hear his voice, they would come to him with a rush, arms and all. And Eumenes had, at this battle, had basically no chance at all. He was a Greek, he was fighting Macedonians with half Macedonian army, and he knew that he was vulnerable to that. And he won the day by a ruse. He placed his non-Greek speaking soldiers on the Craterus, on the wing where Craterus was fighting, so that the soldiers could not hear what the poor man was yelling at them, meaning, join my ranks. And he won it by personal action, by a very chivalrous and Homeric-like duel with Neoptolemus, which has a very nice description in Plutarch. And this kind of wars had this particularity that the king's charisma had to attract the soldiers of the enemy, to lure them to its camp. And this is why the Seleucid kings paid so much attention to having the charisma of Alexander. And now we move to almost the final points. This is how a legend is made. As you can see on the left, there are, for instance, the omens preceding Alexander's birth, and on the right we have omens preceding Seleucus' birth. And there are several passages dealing with that. I've only chosen this one because it is probably what Seleucus himself accepted from this Vulgata. Later on, he was to become a son of Apollo, and in that dream that his mother had, just like in the dream Olympias had, later on a god was to appear, namely Apollo, and thus a new god was born. But Seleucus never sent to have accepted it. It was his son who did it. And the last point that we shall deal with is how to imitate Alexander the Great in this royal hobby of founding cities. And as you can see, and as we all know, that Alexander founded a lot of cities named especially after himself, and one after his horse. We can see that Seleucus was probably a family man and a more courteous man, because he named his cities after the names of members of the family or of his wife. And founding a city was a very royal action in the Hellenistic times. All the dynasties did it, but the Seleucids were the champions. And why they did that? They did that because, as you can see in this inscription, this is a list of priests from the city of Seleucia Imperia, which was founded by Seleucus II. That was where the Nicatorion was founded. The Nicatorion was the temple, a shrine, more like a shrine, where Seleucus' body was preserved, and he was buried. And as you can see, we have a priest of him there. And in this case, it is likely that he was worshipped in Seleucia area, just like he was worshipped in the Roman times, so 500 years after, in Dura Europos, as a city founder. He was a Tistus after all, and that was the privilege of founding a city that at last was an action of a man who had to have some divinity, and it got him closer to Alexander. And the last question was that that should try to comprise all that we have said about, is that we do have imitations of Alexander, but we do not have traces of Alexander's cult in the Seleucid Empire. There are almost no statues of him found there, and there are, as you can see, we have some lists of priests for the Seleucid kings, none of them for Alexander. But we do have traces of the cult of Alexander in Egypt, for instance. Why was that not the case in the Seleucid Empire? And I would conclude by presenting my own hypothesis, is that the Seleucids appropriated the myth of Alexander the Great, but not paying the credit to the founder by presenting them the founder of the dynasty, Seleucus, not as an Alexander, but as a different kind of Alexander, doing the same thing as Alexander did, which the heirs did too, but not, as I said, being Alexander. And I conclude here.